All right. So we are talking about the Cold War today, but I want to go over a couple of little things. Little thing number one, there's like one person in each class that keeps asking me why they can't take the quiz more than once. I don't know, you just can't. Because once you've seen the quiz questions, it gives you an advantage. So really, oh, somebody's barking. The intention was that you just take the quiz once. So I thought I'd been fairly clear about that. Very few of you have that question, but 2 or 3 of you, like one in each class, has it very consistently. So I'm trying to clear it up. One time only on the quiz. The reason I put 2 attempts is in case there's a technology fail or something. So I don't want you to have to, you know, at 11 o'clock at night, try to get in touch with me and like, reset the quiz, please. So I put that in there in case there's a technology fail. And I should be able to tell by how much time you spent on the first attempt. But I'm counting on you to be fairly honest. You know what I'm saying? Okay. Other stuff that we need to talk about. Oh, somebody probably needs to mute. Oh. I think I put the review stuff on there, so let me share that with you really quick.
Yep.
All right, somebody definitely needs to mute. Who needs to mute? Is it Ian?
No.
Okay, I muted Ian, so I think it was him. All right. Goodness. Your life goes on, whether you have class or not. I get it. Yeah, I have the bonus of living alone, so unless that weird cat hops on my back porch. Hang on one sec, sorry. Okay, sorry, I was just checking something. All right, so I put up the review for the quiz thing. And the quiz thing is on the 13th, which is a Friday. I didn't realize we had a Friday the 13th, so I'm very excited about that. So that'll be the day that your questions and the quiz is due. The extra credit thing is due the week before. So we'll go over that here in a minute. So I just made a list of stuff. If I were you, I would make sure I knew these things pretty well. Excuse me. As you prepare for the online quiz. I've not posted that. I won't make that live until the Wednesday before. And it's due on the 13th. So it's 13, 12, 11. On the 11th is when I'll post it where you can start taking it. Excuse me. And so you got the list. Also, when I taught over the summer, I made some online sources, a list of online sources for them. It's mostly History Channel kind of stuff, or government videos, or Disney Goes to War. That stuff's moderately interesting. But all this stuff is really extra. And I don't mean that in the colloquial, like, don't be extra sort of way. But it's, you know, if you want to look at things that, you know, because you have extra time. So, or if there's something on here that you're really interested in. I typically am going to put a biography of each president, and usually they're short or an overview of stuff that they did. This Atomic Cafe trailer is kind of entertaining. Duck and cover video about, you know, how to make yourself safe during nuclear war. You probably need to watch that. You just never know. That desk could save your life. We did duck and cover drills all the time where I grew up, but I grew up in Joplin, Missouri, where we had tornadoes all the time. So we really needed duck and cover drills. All right, but all this stuff is optional, but just in case you wanted it. So, oh, and I think, yeah, when we get to chapter 24, we'll talk more about that. But I don't know what it is with young people nowadays. They really like John Green, who's the novelist, and he wrote The Stars in Our Eyes or Your Eyes, or I don't know, some sappy novel about some tragic girl who falls in love and then dies, and it's sad, and they made a movie out of it. And he writes lots of novels like that. And he's a very smart man. And he apparently likes to make videos about history, which are pretty good because he consults his high school history teacher. I've definitely seen them and occasionally shown them in class because high school kids love them for some reason. So a lot of times people will consult John Green, the famous historian. rather than, other sites. So I occasionally put a like, hey, don't look at the John Green video on this. Not trying to be rude at all to John Green. I'm just jealous. I'm jealous of John Green and that other guy, Bill O'Reilly, because they're not technically historians, but they've made more money with history than I have. So there you go. All right. So that thing that I just showed you is in the course documents section. And this next thing is the extra credit. Let me find the screen sharing thing. Oh, goodness, there's too many boxes. Technology. Okay. All right, extra credit. This is also posted, I don't know where this is. I think I might have put it in the assignment section. I think so. I may go double check after class, but I mentioned this last time, and this is up to 10 points, so it's the same amount of credit as a weekly question. And it'll go directly into, I'm muting somebody. It'll go directly into your grade program. It won't necessarily go on to test 3, but oh well, you'll get points either way. You're going to write about a use of propaganda. Again, extra credit, you don't have to do it. Government poster campaigns, government video you might have seen regarding Japanese internment. That's my strongest hint for you. I'd use that one. Any other appropriate World War II related subject. This is where you're going to do web research most likely. And I'll expect that you do the things here at the bottom that are mentioned. Discuss the source of the propaganda, like who created it, when was it created, what medium was it, was it print, was it a poster, was it a film, that sort of thing. Who was supposed to see it, where might they see it, that sort of thing. And, oh, goodness. And any part that you think maybe is not accurate. And if you think the propaganda was effective, why you think that, that sort of thing. So your book might help you with this, but this is probably going to be stuff that you do outside of the textbook. And my strongest suggestion is this Japanese internment video. Now, some of you are going like, man, I don't have time to watch a video. I had stuff to do. I know, I got stuff to do. But it's only 9 minutes. And it's interesting, I think. It's a government-created video that explains why Japanese internment camps were essential. So I'd watch it if I were you. I would. I think that's the easiest one to do. But I think my links are proper. These go to propaganda posters, and those will be pretty clear as well. If you do talk about the propaganda posters rather than the video, make sure you tell me what poster you're talking about, what's pictured on it, because sometimes people will do that and go like, this poster looks like, it's scary and it exaggerates this, but you don't tell me which poster. So make sure you tell me that. Okay. First thing I was showing was the study guide for the Unit 3 timed questions, and that should be in the course documents section. And I think the thing I was just showing is in the assignment section, I think. But I'll double check, okay? All right, you guys have any other questions before we get started? All right. Yeah, somebody's shouting out every 15 minutes for a stretch break if you miss the first part of class. No, my physical therapist told me I had to stop every 15 minutes when I'm teaching online and stretch. Telling you, getting old. All right. Oh, and I mentioned before class started that you can only take a quiz once. But even though I have 2 things, 15 minutes, you're ready for your first stretch break. That's funny. No, I'm doing that little scapular stretch while I talk to you. So I'm telling you this. I know one of you told me to look at some video, Smashworks or something. That just sounded violent. I don't know if I'm up for that. All right, so we talked about World War II a little bit last time. And what happens right after World War II is more war. Yeah, more war. So sorry for the Cold War, Vietnam, well, not in that order, Cold War, and then Korean conflict, Vietnam conflict, intervention in all sorts of places. We're going to overthrow some governments. We're going to do all kinds of stuff. All of it's noble and pure, though, because the United States, go team. It's interesting, though, because some of it you look at and you go like, no, that was probably a really good idea. Some of it you look at, it's like, why in the world did we do that? And I don't know. But this is where you get to use your judgment about whether stuff was good or bad, or had a good motive, bad motive, all that. All right. So when the war is over, we're thinking about a bunch of stuff. How do we make the world a better place? How do we make sure there's not World War III? Now that we're out of the Great Depression, how do we make sure there's not another one of those? So we want to eliminate freedom from want if possible. And we use all the extra money that we just made prosecuting a war to eliminate poverty. But there's some other stuff going on, and it's evil and godless. And you know what it is. It's communism. So this evil, godless communist thing is going to overwhelm us, and we're going to be very distressed about it. Now, if you were old like me and you had to stretch every 15 minutes because your shoulder doesn't work properly, you would also be afraid of communism, because that's what our generation did. We were scared of communists because we knew they were evil and godless. You younger people, you may not understand how evil and godless communism is. So I'll do my best to explain it to you. I know some of you are thinking, no, how can an economic system be evil and godless? All you have to do is add Stalin to it, and then it's evil and godless. Just trust me on this. So certainly people in this generation equated communism with a political system that also included a dictatorship. Now, I had a student one time who was from a country called Macedonia. You've probably heard of it. And that country was communist and run, pretty nicely and pretty equitably, because they had that, oh goodness, the enlightened despot leader. That when you look at the study of classical government, people who invented that study said the best government you could have would be that government that was led by an enlightened despot. So you've got one guy in charge, but he always makes the right decision. And since that guy didn't really exist, except maybe briefly in Macedonia, and honestly, that country was run pretty nicely. However, it's small and didn't control other places, and the Soviet Union kind of did. So most communist countries usually kind of coupled with a dictatorship that wasn't as benevolent. And we can easily say that about the Soviet Union. You can say that about China in the Chairman Mao era. And you might be able to say that about Castro. I don't know. But we'll talk about this stuff later. It's really hard to to disagree that Stalin was a bad guy. So, all right, back to business. So communism is going to be the overwhelming theme of foreign policy during this time period. And the idea that the world was really divided into two teams: Team USA, the best team; Team Soviet Union, the evil, godless communist team. So, and there really wasn't much room to be in the middle and say like, well, I kind of like this about the Soviet Union, but I kind of like that about the USA, because then you're a traitor and we don't like you. And that's the best thing I can say about you, is that we don't like you. So growing fear of communism is going to really squelch any goals other than foreign policy goals for a period of time. Now, during this era, because we're so focused on foreign policy, we're also going to build the military quite a bit, which is going to lead to an economic boom, which is going to give us resources, which will maybe make us start to think about how it'd be a good idea to end poverty. So some interesting things come out of this era, some of them really good, some of them not so good, and most of them somewhere in the middle, because that's kind of the way life is, I suppose. But again, you'll get to make all those value judgments. We'll talk about stuff that happened. You can decide if it's all right. So we want to end we want to have freedom from want and freedom from fear. So we want to end tyranny abroad. So, and we want to end discrimination. But that also might mean that we have to talk about discrimination within the United States as well, which is going to be a really uncomfortable decision or discussion in the middle of this two poles, good and evil, United States and Soviet Union. How can it be that we are good, but we still practice discrimination? So bringing that up during this era may not make you very popular. So it's, I don't know, it's a weird time. We did understand there was unlikely to be direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, we did think that the Soviet Union was going to try to spread its influence throughout the world, and we needed them not to do that. So to counter that, we were going to try to spread our influence throughout the world. But we're going to do it in different ways. At least we see it that way. The Soviet Union is going to occupy countries near them. So we'll refer to those as the Soviet sector, the Soviet bloc, or Soviet satellite countries. And they do include a few of the ones listed here: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and eventually, we'll think for a while, China potentially, North Korea, North Vietnam later on, so which just turns into Vietnam, and other countries too in that region. We'll have State Department employee George Kennan, who will write about foreign policy in something called the Long Telegram, where he's going to suggest that what we need to do, we're not in a position to end communism, but what we need to do is contain the spread of communism. His suggestion will also be that there are two mortal enemies in the world, the United States and the Soviet Union, and our goal really is to contain the spread of communism, but the evil, godless communists of the Soviet Union would like to eliminate the United States, hence our mortal enemy. Now, we don't want to kill everybody in the Soviet Union. We just want them to stop spreading their thing and let the rest of the world decide peacefully, because we know they'll pick us if they get to pick. So we'll suggest that we are not really trying to take over countries, because we typically don't send our military in to occupy. Now, I know that sometimes we do. We typically use economic incentives, and that's no lie. All right. So Kennan's telegram will suggest the containment policy. Winston Churchill, who becomes pretty popular outside of England after World War II, he gets unelected pretty quickly after World War II. They knew that he was their guy for the war, but when the war was over, they felt like they needed a different prime minister. So when he loses re-election, he goes on a speaking tour, and he comes to the United States quite a bit. It's a really good place to go and make a lot of money giving speeches. So he didn't necessarily make a lot of money for all the speeches, certainly not the Iron Curtain speech. He's speaking at a commencement, I think, at Missouri Military Academy, which is it's like a high school, a military high school, for people in the Midwest that maybe want to enter a military academy. So kind of expensive, but not super expensive kind of thing. Working class expensive sort of school. So he probably didn't make millions of bucks for that speech. But in that speech, he says that an Iron Curtain is developing all over Europe, and that the lights are going out all over Eastern Europe. So starting to talk about the divide between communist and not communist countries in Europe. So developing struggle long-term between Eastern communism and Western capitalism. All right, time for definitions. Here we go. Definition number 1, containment, limiting or controlling or containing the spread of communism. Yes, the evil, godless sort. Yes, communism. Okay, so because communism is bad, we want to make sure that it doesn't spread throughout the world. The Iron Curtain It's the idea of partitioning, division between Eastern and Western Europe. There's no actual fence, no actual wall, no actual curtain, but clearly a divide between the democratic and free countries of the West and the communist-controlled Eastern Europe, which is dominated by the Soviet Union, probably directly with a militarily installed government. Truman Doctrine arises after an attempted communist overthrow of internal, so there are parties within Germany and not Germany. There are definitely some in Germany, but for the parties within Greece and Turkey, communist parties, that want to take over their government. So the British had been sending money to the non-communist forces in Greece and Turkey to try to put down these internal revolutions. Well, England's recovering from World War II in a way that we're not. I mean, they got the crap bombed out of them. We didn't so much. I know about Pearl Harbor, but you know, basically our country was untouched directly by this conflict. So the English said, hey, or the British said, we can't afford this. Can you guys take this over? And we went, yeah, we'll take that over. So in the we'll take over the funding of this speech, Truman also says that we will pledge whatever you need, military, economic assistance, if you need to resist an internal communist revolution. And if it's external, we'd probably help with that too. So Truman is going to ask the Congress for $400 million to send to Greece and Turkey, which they will agree to, and will suggest that we should be willing to spend up to half of our gross domestic product to fight the spread of communism. So half of the entire amount of money that's made in a year within the United States on anti-communist defense. If you're wondering, did we ever do that? Heck no, we never, no. And we never spent, you know, half of our gross domestic product on the war effort. We never spent half of our budget on the war effort. Of course, our budget is less than our annual gross domestic product. I say, of course, like you should know that. I don't know why you would know that. So sorry. But if you look at how our budget, national budget breaks down federal budget, typically we spend half of it on social programs, mostly welfare, I'm sorry, not welfare, but welfare type programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Yeah. Mostly for older folks. Old folks are expensive, not old like me, I'm still paying for my own stuff, but old like my dad. Yeah. He occasionally will like text me and thank me when he goes to the doctor. Go like, thanks, and I'll go, for what? He goes, you just paid for my doctor visit. It's like, all right, Dad, you're welcome. Crazy old people. But we've never spent half of our budget on military stuff. It's not what we do. But we mentioned this because we wanted to show that we were willing to do it to help fight the spread of, you know what, evil, godless communism, because it's bad. All right, the Marshall Plan. Oh, did I mention Truman was the president? See, I assume that you are aware of this stuff. Truman became vice president for round 4 of FDR's presidencies. I forget, why do I, John Nance, Garner Nance, I think was the vice president before. I think he died. You need another stretch break. All right. I shouldn't have mentioned the stretch break at all, but oh goodness. I think because you guys are the middle class, I don't mean like you're the middle class, like you earn $40,000 a year or something, but because you're my middle of the day class. I go the first class without a stretch break, and then my shoulder's just killing me for your class. So I'm going to try to stop whining about that, maybe. But I'll stop and tell you why Truman was vice president. Okay. Because he was only vice president for the 4th term. John Garner Nance, I think that was his name. And I think he was Texan, was vice president, and he passed away. I think I'm right about this, but I know whoever it was passed away. And then FDR said, man, I got to get another vice president because you have to have one. And he said, who can I get that, you know, because the war was over, or it was ending. It was very clear that we were about to win. But, you know, we want to, FDR says, I just want to see the whole thing through. People are okay with that, except in the South, people are getting a little tired of FDR because, well, his wife was so pro-civil rights. And, you know, do we really need to be pro-civil rights? Because the South's got, you know, federalism, states' rights, all that kind of stuff. Like, the South doesn't want to do that. So, and FDR's got that problem that Democrats have, where in the North, the cities like you, but in the South, the KKK likes you. So it's really hard to make both halves of that party happy. So he's got to find a vice president that might, this sounds bad, but might appeal to the KKK guys that run the South. Now, I am not suggesting to you that everyone in the South is racist and all are KKK members. It's really hard for me not to suggest to you that in the Deep South, if you're going to be in elected office, that being a KKK member doesn't help. It does during this time period. So, and I'm not trying to be anti-South. I'm trying to be historically correct on that. But if you read stuff from this time period, it will back me up. And again, not suggesting everyone in the South is racist, but the guys that control politics tended to be pretty racist in the South. We'll see more evidence of that as we go along. So FDR's got to find somebody that appeals to the South. So he picks Harry Truman. Now, I say this as a big fan of Harry Truman because he's from the great state of Missouri. Yes, my home state, although Texas, my adopted state, I'm very fond of. Your weather tends to be better, except those hurricane things. Harry Truman was senator, from a segregating state. And so, and Missouri is a really weird state historically, politically. I mean, you know about Missouri Compromise. Northern part of Missouri acted a little more like the North. I guarantee you the southern part of Missouri thought it was the South, and the deep South, not Texas South, but Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi South. And I say this, you know, having a great grandmother that consistently flew a Confederate flag, and it's like, so confusing. I was like, why? Why are you doing that? But Southern Missouri. So the thought was getting this guy, and plus the Missouri politics, if you know anything about Missouri politics, which I don't know why you would, the cities, Kansas City and St. Louis, which is where the bulk of the population is, their political stuff, those are both in the North, by the way. And I know you're going like, I thought that was in Kansas. No, it's right on the border of Kansas and Missouri. And then St. Louis is right on the border of Illinois and Missouri. So St. Louis East, Kansas City West, both of those cities, and they're connected by a highway. Both of those cities are controlled by the mafia. Their government's controlled by the mafia. So you got like KKK action in the South and the mafia in the North. Missouri's a little bit of a mess politically. So the thought was a guy like Truman would just do what he was told by controlling factors who might be leaning toward corrupt, but who understood the complexities of trying to control the Democrats in the South. So yeah, they picked Harry Truman because they thought he might appeal to racist people in the South. And Democrats voting, white Democrats in the South would, yeah, okay. So there you go. Now, that doesn't turn out to be who Truman is. Now, Foner, who's definitely not from the great state of Missouri, so doesn't understand how much we love Harry Truman, is going to talk about how Harry Truman just does some of the stuff he does to win re-election or election, which might be true. Might be true. But anyway, Truman gets to be the vice president, and then FDR dies at the beginning of term number 1 in April. I mean, you take office in January, he passes away pretty quickly thereafter. So Truman's really thrust into this job without really expecting to be in charge. And it's funny, you think like, could he not just look at FDR and go like, that dude's old and it's not going well? Well, apparently not. So Truman becomes president, and he's really thrust into a situation that's kind of surprising to him. And he'll do some things that are kind of surprising. He'll do some very conservative things with foreign policy in some ways. And then he ends up wanting to desegregate a lot of stuff. And then people go, what the heck? That's not why we picked him. So he's, I think, an interesting character. And also, I think he's the only president in the 20th century that didn't go to college. I think I'm right about that, but I could be wrong. But I think I'm right. No, we didn't go to college because it's Missouri. We didn't go to college. It's not what we did. Also, he's from a generation where, people, as a rule, didn't go to college. He did serve in World War I. A lot of presidents in this era had served in the military, so he's along those lines. And certainly, I think FDR did before he was paralyzed. Yeah, but okay, back to business. Truman Doctrine, we already talked about that. Marshall Plan, oh gosh. Marshall Plan. George Marshall, who had been a major general in World War II, was Harry Truman's Secretary of State. And Marshall is giving a speech at the Harvard graduation. There's a reminder that when you have your graduation speech, you should pay attention to it. Do you guys remember your high school graduation speech? I'm trying to think if I remember mine. There is definitely not a foreign policy plan enunciated in my high school graduation. I really don't even remember my college graduation speeches. I think they were just given by the college president. But if they invite the Secretary of State, something might be up, so pay attention. All right, so he says, you know what, we're going to extend the idea of the Truman Doctrine to domestic policy as well. Oh, someone admitted sleeping. Okay, that's good. A lot of people probably were. My husband would always talk about his high school graduation speech because they did it outdoors. He graduated from San Angelo Central High School, and they had an outdoor speech, and he was a Baptist preacher. And if you've ever been to a Baptist church, they don't know that, the sermon's supposed to be short. So it's not Catholic, I'm just telling you. So this guy was going on, and my husband said we could just see the rain clouds coming. I was like, dude, you got to wrap this up so we can get our diplomas. Wrap it up. And he didn't stop speaking till it rained, so they didn't get their diplomas. My husband, he's deceased, but he's probably still angry somewhere in heaven. He's probably talking to God like, why didn't you let that Baptist preacher stop so I get my diploma? All right, back to Marshall. Sorry, I'm going to blame the shoulder pain. John Marshall said that we need to extend this foreign aid beyond the military sector into the domestic sector. So he announced or enunciated, either way, the Marshall Plan, which said that we are willing to make major investments in Western Europe to countries that want to rebuild their economy as long as, one, they submit a plan to the United States, and two, within that plan, there's a list of the how the government's going to be structured, which has to include a multi-party state. So what this means is you can't be communist because communism is supported by a single party state. So you have to have at least two political parties. So most Western European nations did submit plans that were funded to the tune of $17 billion. And some of you are going like, that doesn't even pay for schools in the state of Texas. Like, well, I think it probably just about does. But during this time period, it's pre-inflationary dollars. So that was a lot of money. It really was. Yeah, some of you are going like, it'd be a lot of money to me. Me too. But this was enough to thoroughly rebuild Western Europe after being demolished in World War II, and really led to a general economic revival in Western Europe that stabilized both the economies and the governments of those nations in a time period where without that, there would have been a lot of instability most likely. And part of our theory behind this was that if the government is economically, or if the country is economically stable, there's less likely to be a revolution. That is historically about 100% true, just about, with the exceptions being the United States, perhaps, because certainly lots of colonists were making plenty of money, but they wanted more control over their government, which is crazy rich people want to control stuff too. All right, but we benefited from them, didn't we? All right, so Marshall Plan, incredibly successful, leads to general economic revival in Western Europe. Okay, so some of you are wondering two things. One, how long is she going to talk? You know how long I'm going to talk. And two, what's going on in the Pacific? That's what you're wondering, isn't it? What happened to Japan? When they lost, did we just go like, hey, good luck, rebuild yourself? Or did we stay there and help them? Or did we stay there and control them? And I'm going to go with that option. We stayed there and controlled them. But we rebuilt them in the process. I'm sure they were very appreciative. They probably were, because they had not too many options, right? All right. So after World War II, the US keeps large number of forces in Japan and Korea as well, although we're going to withdraw them from Korea and we're going to send them back a couple of years later to help rebuild both those countries, Korea and Japan. We're going to focus our emphasis on Japan quite a bit because we defeated them in World War II. If you're wondering like whose side was Korea on, Korea was invaded and controlled by Japan. So we're rebuilding parts of Korea because, you know, in the war effort, some of it got destroyed. Plus, their government's pretty fractured. So we're going to divide both Korea and Germany into 4 different sectors. Each of those sectors controlled by one of the allied nations, England, France, Soviet Union, United States. Okay. All right. So, but Japan, we just said, nope, that's ours. So we controlled Japan. We help Japan rewrite their constitution. We rewrite it for them. And in that, it includes a multi-party state. It includes popular elections. They had had an imperial government before, which really was controlled more by the warlords than the royal family. Voting rights for women, and a small defensive navy. Now, somebody in the last class said that they just amended their constitution to improve, or I'm sorry, increase the size of their defense, of their military. But for most of the modern history of Japan, the United States was their defense force. The goal was to have an economically vital democracy in the Pacific because we knew there was going to be conflict with nations that were leaning towards communism. All right. Colton really needs a break. I can see this. Okay. All right. Why don't we stop for just a minute? That'll give me I will get up and walk around for like a minute and you can look at my cereal boxes. I think what's left is Rice Krispies. So take like a little break and I'll go stretch for just a second instead of just stretching in front of you. So 12:45 is like 12:47. Okay. Colton's got his break. Also, if you need to go pee or something, do that. I won't because, I mean, you know. All right, 2 minutes, was that good? Are you happy now? I actually have the little pulleys for physical therapy right over there, so I actually did that for like a minute. It does actually feel better, so, oh goodness. All right, it really does feel better. Colton, good job. All right, I like that. That's nice. What were we talking about? Japan. Let's feel a lot better. My physical therapist was right. Colton must work for him. Okay. All right, so Japan has a new government because we helped them devise it. And we really wanted Japan to succeed economically because we didn't want them to go evil, godless, and communist like China was headed, and maybe North Korea and some other countries as well. So we rebuild a lot of the stuff. We rebuild a lot of the stuff that we broke or that was broken toward the end of the war with the, that's the word I couldn't think of last class, conventional bombing that preceded the atomic bombing. There's a lot of stuff to rebuild in Japan. So since we're rebuilding everything, everything's new, and they have a couple of decades of really dramatic economic growth and prosperity. I'm not trying to suggest it's really good that we nuke Japan. I am not suggesting that. I'm saying that we really recreate Japan in our image, which for better or worse, whatever. But it's an interesting country because economically it's more Western, but culturally it's still very Eastern. So interesting country, I think, to me at least. Okay, all right. One of our military leaders, one of the guys who's really in control of a lot of things that happens there is Douglas MacArthur. And he's going to refer to that region in a really kind of uncomfortable way historically as an Anglo-Saxon lake. So he's going to suggest that the rebuilding of the Pacific that's controlled by the United States and the Western Allies is successful because of what I just said, that we rebuild these countries in the US economic and political image. So we modernize and westernize them. So, and there's some truth to, I mean, there's some truth that we do modernize and westernize them, but you know, again, they weren't exactly asking for help. You're wondering what's going on in Germany? Well, you know, they're 0 for 2 in the world wars, so we're going to help them rebuild as well. We're going to divide Germany into 4 different sectors, one controlled by England, one France, one US, one USSR. Pretty quickly, these 3 Western allies will merge their sectors, and they'll turn into what people of my generation consistently refer to as West Germany. And then the eastern sector, which is Soviet controlled, will be East Germany. The capital of Germany is Berlin, and that's in East Germany. So that city will also be divided into 4 different sectors controlled by the 4 different allies. And it'll be a source of frustration to all of the allies, including the Soviet Union. The biggest frustration the Soviet Union has with it is that people who live in East Berlin will consistently emigrate to West Berlin because their economies contributed to by Western Europe, the Western allies. So it's more successful economically. So you can make more money there. So people move there. So this is very frustrating to the East because they see it as a sign that they're culturally inferior, that sort of thing. So what they decide to do is block Berlin from Western supply routes. So they close off the roads that go outside of East Berlin or East Germany, and they shut off the airports and the train stations to traffic from outside of East Berlin so that the Western nations can't get supplies in to their people. So their thought is, here's their thought. The Western countries are kind of fat and happy at this point. They do not want World War III, and they don't care enough about West Berlin that they're going to put up any sort of fight at all. So if the Soviet Union decides to cut off West Berlin from the rest of Western Germany, none of those countries are going to do anything about it, especially the United States, which is separated by an ocean and is the fattest and happiest of all these countries, and really didn't get harmed during World War II in the same way that the other countries did. So they just thought we'd be weak because that's who we were to them. It's like, yeah, that's a fat, happy, weak country that just scoops it, comes in at the last minute, and, that's all that they have the stamina for. So now we have President Truman, who is in an election year in 1948, because, we like to mess with each other during elections. It's true. And you still see that now. We've seen that for at least 100 years. It's not as uncommon as it might seem. So the Soviet Union decides that they'll mess with President Truman during an election year. And if you're wondering, does the Soviet Union want another president? Yes. Do they want another president because they fear Harry Truman? Nah, probably not. They want another president because each time you get a new president, there's this chaos and upheaval, and it's easier to take advantage of or do something, that we're not expecting when we're concerned about reconstructing our government. I don't mean that like in a big R post-Civil War reconstructing, but like happens every 4 or 8 years when the other party gets back into power, and then you get new secretaries of this and that, and there's a huge difference between this president's style and that president's style, and everybody adjusts. That takes at least a year most of the time. So the thought is new presidents weaken us on the international stage. So typically when countries intervene in our election, they want to see the incumbent out and a new guy in. And, sometimes they might think, well, I can deal better with the new guy. Usually they think we can mess with him while he figures out what he's doing. That's usually what. But anyway, back to this. So election year, and of course, Truman's thinking about this because his election's going to be really close, and he's not popular the way FDR was, and he's pretty nondescript. I mean, he's not as famous as FDR. He doesn't have a super outgoing personality. He actually seems a little dull. He kind of does. He's just kind of your average common man. He'll be the only guy in the modern era who, after his presidency, just goes home. He doesn't go around giving speeches. He doesn't get involved in political stuff at all. He just goes home and lives his life really quietly. Everybody else is, a little larger than life and makes a bunch of money giving speeches and, wants to continue to build their legacy. Truman's like, I'm out. I just want to go home. So he's different. He really is. But he's got to figure out, how do I get reelected? But he also wants to do the right thing here, and who knows what the right thing is. So here's what he decides, along with, of course, advisors. No sense sending the military in a big way. Like, we don't want to start World War III. The Soviet Union was definitely correct about that. However, you don't want to just give in to the Soviet Union because they block off your supplies. So he used what we will refer to as American ingenuity. Those same planes that drop bombs, they can drop other stuff too. So we put literally thousands of tons of supplies on pallets and drop them by parachute into West Berlin. So we just kind of drop crates of supplies all over West Berlin. And the Soviet Union goes like, that's cool, but they won't keep that up. There's no way that they have the resources to do that. So 11 months later, we're still doing it. And then eventually the Soviet Union goes like, yeah, the election's over. He got reelected. We're done. Just open the train lines and the roads again. So that's what they did. So the Berlin blockade, which is what the Soviets did, was met by the Berlin airlift, which is what the Truman ordered U.S. military did, and worked pretty well, very well. And a lot of people will credit that with being the reason that Truman actually gets elected. I would say reelected, but he was just elected to the vice presidency the first time. All right, so we have Berlin blockade, we have Berlin airlift. This is followed pretty quickly by the creation of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance of Western nations that really want to align themselves against the Soviet Union. This happens in part because of the stuff in Berlin, but also more because the Soviet Union developed an atomic weapon. It's like, oh, now they've got the bomb too. Later, 5 or 6 years later, the Soviet-controlled nations or Soviet bloc of nations, Eastern European nations, will form the Warsaw Pact, Warsaw being in Poland, to counter NATO. So Truman gets reelected, and then we'll talk a lot about his second term as we move forward. Okay, last thing I wanted to talk to you about before we go today is the Korean conflict, but I'm going to stop for a second, see if you guys have any questions. You guys have any questions thus far? I know at least one of you is going to recommend a stretch break here in a minute. That really did help. Using those pulleys was good. Good job, employee of my physical therapist. All right, I'm going to say you have no questions because I don't see any. Seeing no questions, we will talk about the Korean conflict. Let me see if I can find. Sarna. I hate it when it tells me I can't do something. Like, you cannot minimize the screen during Zoom. Maybe I want to. You don't tell me what to do, except it does. All right, that's what I wanted to show you, if I can find it. Okay, now I have to find you again. How did this happen? There you are. Okay. It's weird. I have a weekend and I forget about how all technology works. Dang it. The thing I just opened went away. Poo-poo. Let me open that again. Why did that happen? I know I'm making a face at the screen right now. Because I can't figure out how to open stuff. Yeah, I need another break. This is a mental health break. Let me go back to this. Okay. All right, I'll open it from here. So in the online sources, I've got the Korean War overview, which is a timeline of all the stuff that happens in Korea, and then a Korean War map. So I want to look at both of those things really quickly, if I can figure out how to open them and show them to you. What in the world? I got a commercial. I didn't want a commercial, really. Oh, that's actually a video. I didn't want to watch the video. Poop. I feel so bad that I'm recording this as well. You can show this to people. It's like, you want to see how inept my professor is with technology? It's like, okay. All right. I'm going to try one more time. If it doesn't work, I might just swear, which I so rarely do. It's going to work. All right. It only took 2 minutes. All right. So the reason I like this Korean War map is that it shows the progress of the Allied, the NATO nations and the Soviet, China, North Korea combo at the same time. So when it starts over, notice that it progresses. When the US enters the war effort, South Korea only controls that little section that was blue at first by Pusan. And then the US will lead an assault at Incheon. And then it ends up leading to control of all of South Korea within a few weeks. Then it pushes all the way up within a few months. So the US gets involved in June of 1950. So here it's going to start over again, which is where you get this little corner of Pusan, which they'll show pretty quickly. And then the assault at Incheon happens a couple months later. Then they control almost all of South and North by Thanksgiving. By Christmas of 50, it's back down to the 38th parallel, which is where it stays for most of the war effort. So most of the war, about 2 years, is a stalemate pretty close to the 38th parallel, which leads to really high casualty numbers because you've got fighting along, you essentially have a modern version of trench warfare with incredibly effective military equipment. So I don't know, I just kind of like that because the map moves. I'm easily entertained. And the other source I was trying to show you was a timeline. I really didn't want to show you a video. But let me go back to the notes because I can probably open those without too much trouble. And I'll feel like I don't have to give back a college degree. Maybe I do. All right. So back to Korean conflict. So 1950, there are talks going on after World War II because Japan had invaded Korea and done some horrific things to people within Korea. They tortured and killed a lot of people. They captured women and made them prostitutes for the Japanese troops. There's also, if you ever want to read about horrific stuff that happens to somebody during war, I don't know why you'd want to read that, but it's true. So you can read about what happens to Korea at the hands of Japan. This also might explain if you have friends who are from Korea and they're not super excited about people from Japan, it's probably, a historical grudge or maybe family member thing. I know I had a high school student from Korea, and anytime we talked about anything bad that happened in Japan, he got super excited. And before he graduated, I said, hey, we got to talk about this because you're about to go to university and you're going to meet some people from Japan. And they go, but you know what they did to my grandpa? And I went, you got to remember, it's the people you're meeting at college didn't do that to your grandpa. Plus, once you're here, there's a part of you that's got to be a little more American if you can do it. I mean, don't forget your history, but remember that the Japanese folks that you meet in the United States probably weren't as involved in that as, so it's an interesting discussion. I think he really mellowed out as he got older. But anyway, Korean conflict, there's going to be a unification election for North and South Korea. So they're going to pick a government, and neither side is convinced that they're going to win the election. So the more Western factions, they take their troops up, but they continue to advise and fund the people in the South. And the more Eastern faction, the Soviet Union, doesn't remove its troops. So once the Western faction takes the troops out of South Korea, the Eastern faction, led by Soviet troops and commanders, has North Korea invade South Korea. Then the civilian leaders in South Korea go to the UN Security Council and say, help, we got invaded. Now, the UN, which had recently been created to help stop international conflict before it starts and to solve international disputes, domestic, military, whatever, said, you know what, you're right. They invaded you. We should do something to help this movement stop. So NATO agreed, NATO nations agreed as well, even though some other nations did not agree, but the majority did. So the UN devised a multinational force, which was led, of course, by the United States to help remove the North Koreans from South Korea. You noticed in the little moving map that they didn't stop at that they went all the way in certain parts of North Korea to the Yalu River, which is the border with China. So they ended up pushing the North out of the South, but then controlling a lot of North Korea. This is going to lead to China adding troops to the military, several 100,000 troops, and then pushing the stalemate of the fighting back to the 38th parallel. This is also going to lead to General MacArthur getting fired because he decides that it'd be a good idea for us to take over China and maybe nuke them in the process. He's going to mention that out loud. Truman will go to Korea and say like, hey, MacArthur, here's a medal for all that you've done. And then privately, he's like, MacArthur, you got to shut up about nuking China. Don't talk about that anymore. So then MacArthur persuades some of his allies back in the United States to start writing to the Congress about nuking China. And then Truman goes like, man, I've had it. And he just fires MacArthur, which is a very unpopular move for him because MacArthur's way more popular than he is. But it's like, I just don't want to nuke China, and MacArthur's out of control. So when Eisenhower runs for president in 1952, so Truman served his entire term. Both the Democrats and the Republicans want Eisenhower to run because he's Eisenhower, not because of his political thoughts, but because he is probably the most famous, most heroic part of the US military in World War II. And he's also the head of NATO. It's like everyone loves Eisenhower, and nobody really knows where he stands politically, which is probably ideal in some ways. So both the Democrats and the Republicans beg him to be their nominee. He chooses the Republicans and runs for office. And he says, if you elect me, I will go to Korea and end the war. And people go like, man, if anybody can do it, it'd be Eisenhower because he planned D-Day. He's a World War II guy. So they elect him in 52, and the ceasefire is signed in 53 because Eisenhower goes to Korea and Stalin dies, not on the same day or anything, but Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, was really the impetus for sending the troops into South Korea. Now, many people apparently within the Communist Party and the Soviet Union thought that this was not worth the effort. It was too expensive and too risky, because if you lost this, you would look bad. Getting control of Korea wasn't that big of a deal. China was already communist, so that region, China is enormous. You've seen it on the map. So that region is fairly well controlled between the Asian side of the Soviet Union and China. So a lot of people who advised Stalin didn't think he was right, but here's the problem. If you disagree with Stalin, he has you killed. So when he dies, they felt a little more freed up to express their opinion, and they said, you know what, we're out. And they told the Chinese and North Korean forces, you can keep all the stuff, but we're not sending you any more, and you are in charge of all the troop movements. And they go like, hey, we're done. So the North and the South sign a ceasefire. Now, they never negotiate a treaty, so that war, I guess, is technically not over. But there's a ceasefire and the fighting stops. You end up with North Korea and South Korea with the promise of unification later, which still hasn't happened, and a demilitarized zone, which I think is about 15 miles apart. So a little strip down the 38th parallel where nobody lives, and it's armed pretty heavily on both sides. So no formal peace treaty, no formal unification yet, although who knows, could happen maybe. A sign that global harmony is unlikely. The US promotes decolonization, so the country should start to give up their colonies. We've certainly, whatever land that we had control of, we are changing their status. The Philippines become independent during this era, and the Guam and Puerto Rico become territories rather than protectorates, which grants them a certain type of constitutional right, with the possibility of becoming states at some point if they.
The red card.
What?
Yeah.
I think Catherine got a red card or something. So South Korea doesn't unify. Decolonization, the United States start to do this, but again, we don't have that many colonies. Our European friends are not quite ready for this, but that's going to happen whether they want it to or not over the next 20 or 30 years. Okay. This seems like a good place to stop, so I'm going to stop. But before you run off, which I know you want to, because you want to go eat lunch or something, or maybe you want to stretch your shoulder, which I completely understand. Let me double check on the roll. Let me stop recording too.